Can you actually believe that Shimmering Skies metagame has already had not one, not two, three tournaments of over 130 players, just really shaping the metagame as we lean in and move toward the Disney Lorcana challenges with the Shimmering Skies set legal. Crazy to say that through 3 weeks, we've had a lot of different variety of decks that are being registered to tournaments and a fair amount of different success from those registered decks to top cut decks. In this video, I'm going to be covering 9 different decks that have been successful in tournaments of 50 players or more. And on top of that, showcasing what the total metagame looked like for 3 events of 130 plus players, and then, of course, a look at what the top cut decks have been looking like. So, a lot to cover in this video. Let's get started with the most winning deck of the weekend, Brandon Nicandio's Amber Steel Aggro Lantern deck. Honestly, kind of a bit of a crazy one, but hey, let's get right on into it. Brandon Nicandio took first place in the CCS 10K this past weekend, which was a 180 plus player tournament. And we did it all the while with some Chapter 1 cards that we haven't seen in quite some time in the form of Lantern. Lantern is the 2-cost uninkable item that simply reads Exert this, and you pay 1 less to play your next character. This does include shift cost, so anyone out there that might be a little more unfamiliar with the card, it does allow you to say shift a Robin Hood for 2 ink instead of 3 ink, or of course a Cinderella Stout-Hearted for 4 ink instead of 5 ink, and things like that. What I really love about this deck is it is really leaning into some of the best cards from Shimmering Skies. Pete and Prince Naveen are 2 of the most powerful cards in Shimmering Skies, and we're just double downing on how good those cards truly are. Lantern is kind of living in this world where all we want to do is just drop characters to the board and then play a Prince Naveen to sing a whole new world immediately. Remember, Prince Naveen, when he comes into play, he gets to play a song that costs 6 or less without exerting, without needing to be in play for a full turn. So all we're simply doing is putting a 4-cost 3/3 with 2 lore into play and immediately casting a whole new world to refill our hand. What he also can do, which I really do love about the addition of this character, is that we can have a line of a Cinderella on one or a Robin Hood on one with a follow-up of the Piglet or the Ursula, the Smee, into the Ariel on 3 to find us our song, and then simply just play Naveen on 4 to either sing a whole new world, or of course, maybe we're just going to play Strength of a Raging Fire or Along Came Zeus, remove an opposing threat from the board while still having all of ours established and really maintaining the board presence. All in all, I think this is a very unique take on the list. Took it to a first place finish in an 8-round plus tournament and a top 8 cut. The lines here are all kind of there. They're kind of seen. I love the idea that this deck has plays on the play and going second. So the difference of the games are very, very key, where I feel like very often, we're going to be a Cinderella into a Piglet, into an Ariel on the play, while on the draw, I could see, closer to like a Robin Hood or an Ursula early on. And of course, we're going to still be playing characters like Smee, like Rapunzel as the support roles when we need them. But the Naveen might be the key difference in both of those concepts, where the idea that we can play a Naveen on 4, it's very similar to how we would in the past shift into a Robin Hood on 3, maybe remove a character from the playing field by either challenging or singing a song, and then we would play Ariel on 4 to find the song we're looking for in addition to the whole new world, or to find the whole new world and then sing it. This is a little different now, where we're going to be playing Ariel on 3 quite a bit. So then it sets up the Naveen on 4 to allow you to, when you come into play, sing a whole new world and then still have an Ariel up to sing as well if we need to follow up with a Strength of a Raging Fire or a Zeus or things like that. I do think that this deck is very well positioned. I think that Lantern is a very interesting take and an add to the deck. While it doesn't produce lore or anything like that, it really enables you to kind of go very wide in board state. And when you're doing those things and you have, the removal that we do, and now, of course, the addition of Pete Games Referee, Well, it's okay to go wide if the best way to go wide is to defend it by removing cards like Grab Your Swords, cards like Be Prepared, and things like that by bare necessities. And of course, Pete just coming to play and saying, no, you cannot play those things. Having enough answers to a Shift Sisu will go a long way as well. The craziest thing about this list, of course, is the lack of Daisy Duck. But hey, sometimes this deck might just be good enough without Daisy. We maybe not even need the lore gain. And I think there's just a little bit of an understanding that, hey, just because something is good, something that does feel like it fits, it doesn't mean that it's always necessary. And that's exactly what Decandio proved this past weekend. Huge shout out to you. Congrats. Also, if you're looking to find some more content from Decandio, he just put out 4 wonderful videos, kind of just breaking down the decks of the metagame so far. I'll put the link to Decandio's channel in the description below. Check them out. Another winning deck this past weekend was played by Sander Boss, which was a first place victory in a 64 player tournament featuring none other than Emerald Amethyst. This is a deck that definitely picked up some steam at the most recent DLC in Toronto, but now it has a lot of new toys in the Shimmering Skies metagame, rolling in with Clarabells, Mother Gothels, Bonsais, You're Welcome, and even the Emerald Chromacon and the Library. There are a lot of new cards in this. And of course, one of my favorites is Cogsworth. We're going to be talking about that guy a lot in our next video. But Cogsworth is another great addition to this list and really just kind of giving you so many ways to interact and really do things with a lot of key and tech combo-ish cards. I do believe this deck might be a true threat to this metagame. I'm not exactly certain of the perfect 60, but what I can say for sure is that this deck had an exact replica also top 8 the CCS 10K this past weekend. So 2 decks from 2 very different parts of the world were able to both see a ton of success in fairly large tournaments. So just by saying that and saying, hey, we're able to play the exact same deck list and both be successful in different metagames is definitely something to say, hey, there might be something here. There's a lot of room, I think, for improvement. And I think that this is going to be one of those decks that grows with the metagame as you have to start making choices about what tech cards you really want to play over others. But all in all, success leaves clues for decks like these. And the idea that we had 2 replicas in the same weekend in 2 different events that were both pretty large is enough for everyone to say, hey, maybe we should look at this deck. Maybe we should take it seriously. If you haven't yet, maybe play some games with this deck. I do think that it could be a true threat to the metagame and definitely likely to evolve moving forward over the next couple weeks as we approach the first DLCs of the Shimmering Skies metagame. Shout out to you again, Sander, for an awesome finish. And I believe the second player was Corey Anderson that also finished in top 8. Huge shout out to both players playing this list and really showcasing that Emerald Amethyst might be a threat to the Shimmering Skies metagame. Micah Ellers took first place at the TPN 1-year anniversary tournament in Minnesota. This is a group of friends of mine that I have actually had a lot of fun with in the past. Micah is a very good friend of the channel, a friend of TFM, goes all the way back to our Transformers days, and he truly brought the spice. So much so that I can't even do this deck justice, if I'm being completely honest. So I actually had Micah create a bit of an article for everyone to read and understand what this deck does. So it is featured on the forbiddenmountain.com. You might have not even been aware that we even had a website. So this is a good transition to saying, hey, forbiddenmountain.com, we have some articles up there. It also links to a lot of our YouTube videos and things like that, and even our other channel now. So this is a kind of the first of some content. David Nunez is going to be planning on also writing articles there in the near future. So forbiddenmountain.com might be something new to bookmark as we get more and more content rolling in there. But if you want to know, honestly, more and more about this particular deck, then you got to hear it from Micah firsthand. It is super interesting. There's a lot of very weird cards that I think people really looked over. The Prince John in specific here. King Candy's a card that hasn't picked up a lot of steam. Triton is a card that when it came out, I really loved it. I thought it had a lot of potential, but ended up doing nothing in the Ursula's Return metagame. So this is really just a pile of items. And Micah even explained it to me as draft chaff, which kind of made me laugh. Cards like Potion of Might, is a card that I can't fathom we ever were going to play and construct it. But here we are, first place finish. You got to look at this list and say, is there anything here? Is it something that's so different that most haven't really considered? And that's why, you'd love to see deck lists like this compete and really come out, because with every new set, and I really do love this about the game, every new set really does present new strategies, new synergies. And this is one of those where I think it came out, and I think a lot of people overlooked a lot of these cards. And here we are now taking a second look, because all it takes is one win for a tournament, for a deck like this to pop up and maybe be truly something in the metagame. And the craziest thing about this deck is it costs like $80. It's an incredibly cheap budget deck. So it's not even like it's that expensive to just go and say, hey, let me go try this. Whereas the normal Ruby Sapphire decks are, $300, $400 on average. This is $80. So if you're just looking to try something new and give some cards, that have been stuck in your binder for probably a good portion of their existence, this one might be it. So shout out to Michael, and of course the entire TPN. You guys are awesome. I was there for the first set championships weekend, helping them host their tournaments. It was really cool to see them be successful, have a 62-player tournament, and I'm always kind of rooting for my friends. So congratulations again to Micah and the gang for an awesome tournament. All right, so now we've been through a couple weeks of very large tournaments, right? We're not Disney Lorcana challenge size tournaments, but these are tournaments that are 140 plus players, 140, 170, 186. These are not small tournaments. So I really want to take this opportunity to showcase this list. Now, I know normally we're a little more organized, but I wanted to specifically show you the differences from last week's to this week's. So I left this kind of like not fully functional and just really just showcasing is that last week, you can see on this graph here that we had Amber Steel is the number one deck. Guys, it's still the number one deck. It's probably going to be that way for a little bit here. It's still, nearly double the next closest ink combination. So it's going to take some serious time for that to go away, or to understand that this number might keep towering. If anyone remembers the Chapter 1 metagame, Ruby Amethyst did this very early on also, where Ruby Amethyst was just the most successful deck. It kept going. It kept being successful. More players kept buying into it, kept playing the deck, and it's just kind of snowballed. I think Amber Steel has the potential to do that in this metagame as well, just because of all the different variations that we can see from Amber Steel. However, the next best decks might be really up for debate here, as you're kind of seeing that registered decks, Amethyst Ruby registrations fell off, where Ruby Sapphires kind of eclipsed it a bit here. There's probably about 10 more Ruby Sapphire decks that were registered now in these tournaments. That's notable. Amber Amethyst decks and your Amethyst Emerald decks kind of stayed the same. Amber Ruby and Amethyst Steel were kind of the same. And then Sapphire Steel took a big jump also. In the first few weeks, there wasn't as many of them. I think in this past week, there was a very large jump in numbers. I think there was like 10 to 12 more registered Sapphire Steel decks in the week before, basically jumping that and putting itself in the top 6, maybe even top 5 registered decks in tournaments. And then Amethyst Sapphire didn't really do much. Amber Emerald didn't do much. But then Emerald Steel was another deck that started kind of coming out of nowhere now, and more people are figuring it out, seeing what it's doing without Bucky, understanding what Clarabelle can do and how Clarabelle can offer some new lineup. So there's a lot of very interesting things going on in the early developments for this metagame for registered decks. Again, there's like 15 different decks on this list through the last few weeks. There wasn't anything new added, of course, but there was some additions of saying there was more Amber Sapphire decks, there was more Ruby Steel decks, and I think we're going to start seeing a little bit more of a closer to what these tops are, as it's been proven to see what more successful. We're going to look at what decks have been successful out of this data a little bit longer in the video, but I really wanted to showcase the differences and changes of registered decks from kind of week 1 to week 2 in these more large tournaments. And we're going to keep continuing to do this over the course of the next couple of weeks whenever we get a large tournament to really break down all the data. We were very fortunate to have all of the registered decks from the CCS to add to this particular data point. Might not always be true for every tournament, but it is nice to see this type of data kind of come out so we can really break it down and kind of showcase it to you guys. Now, let's get back to more decks. Kendall Burdett picked up a top 4 at the CCS 10K this past weekend, playing, of course, the Ruby Amethyst. Kendall in the Lorcana community is known as one of the better Ruby Amethyst players in the game, up there with Luca, up there with George. These players that have had continuous success with the Ruby Amethyst playstyle. And what I do love about this is that in the last previous week, we had seen decks that had no new cards from Shimmering Skies. Kendall, not about that. Put 2 libraries in the deck, and I'm sure the card was very good for him. It's nice to see that the deck has the ability to mold and adapt a little bit. Also, last week we saw the 1/3s make a return. That's not Kendall's style. He's more of the turn box followers and Madam Mim. I call it the cantrip style because we're kind of really just leaning into being able to continuously draw cards out of our lower curve. But we do not have Maleficent Sorceress in here. We're kind of realizing that, Merlin Crab might just be way too important. The other key takeaway here is that we're still on the Flynn Rider Sisu train, whereas we've seen some decks get away from that as well, no longer playing Flynn Rider, no longer playing Sisu. So it's really just showcasing that depending on your expected metagame, you're going to make these decisions of what is necessary. And if red blue, might be rising back to the top of more being more played, seeing more success, then Flynn Riders and Sisus are kind of a nice way to cheese that matchup in some cases. But then again, if Ruby Sapphire is adapting to that, maybe it's time to get rid of those cards, move on to other things. Of course, the smaller Sisu does lead into the bigger Sisu, so it still might not go away completely. But what's most shocking to me is the lack of human Sisu, which is a card that we had seen a large uptick in play in weeks 1 and 2 of the metagame, where Kendall didn't have any here. And for what it's worth, I'm not certain that it's correct or incorrect in the Ruby Amethyst playstyle. But what I can say is that it does answer specific cards in a specific metagame. So again, it's just another targeted choice that this deck is always going to have the ability to choose from. If it wants to go a little more low ground, not play the Medusas, but play the Sisus, that's definitely a route that you can take for this playstyle. And just understand that at the end of the day, Ruby Amethyst probably has 85 to 90 playable card choices. So having this 60 card deck, you could make a 75 card list with a bunch of new cards that aren't even on the screen here and kind of still understand that we need to get to 60. And we're just making choices upon the expected metagame. Huge shout out to Kendall for another successful weekend at CCS. Simone Dodge Whitell picked up a second place finish with a 64 player tournament. This is one we had to spotlight because in previous, really what we've seen out of Amber Emerald is your under the sea sing together type archetype with Diablos, with Aerials, with the Muses, and all of those things. And this is a very different look. We are pedal to the metal, Amber Emerald Aggro. Daisy Ducks, Lilos, a Cursed Merfolk for a good measure, the Queen, having the shift lines for the Queen, having Rapunzel, shift lines for the Pegasus, of course, the Piglets. This is really just a balls to the walls aggro deck that's leaning on Clarabelle as its draw outlet. So having the two 1 cost Clarabelle and then the 4/3 cost Clarabelles, which are also in most cases going to be a replacer for itself due to the way that this deck is going to operate as well. So having that fuel, with a 5/6 2 lore closer for shift 5 is a pretty nice way to catch back up in the game and kind of force your opponent to answer you time and time again. Blue, Donald Duck playing the bodyguard route, kind of protecting your early game threats in any game where you can go Daisy into Piglet, into Donald or Baloo. I mean, you're just threatening so much lore so quickly, and there really aren't a ton of decks that can contend with that. Hey Hey is the very interesting choice for this list. It feels like it's one of those cards that you're acknowledging that you need to get to Clarabelle at some point, but you don't necessarily want to ink to 7. So having a Hey Hey is pretty great. It's also the concept of Hey Hey versus Clarabelle, going first and going second, and understanding that Hey Hey is much better going second, Clarabelle much better going first. So you're always kind of just inking probably the opposite one when you're in that situation. Of course, I think the Clarabelle overall is a better play in most of the game states, But hey, in this type of list is probably always online at some point in the game. And in the end, he is a two lore character for three, so that's also notable. As in this deck, we really are filled with two lore, turn our card sideways and gain lore. Really no shock to me that this early on we're seeing versions of Amber decks this way. I think that if we really consider the Shimmering Skies metagame and we look at a card like Daisy Duck, you just have to understand that Amber has a potential in every in combination for this type of strategy. And I think many are just trying to figure out like what is the best version of that. Is it steel? Is it amethyst? Is it emerald? Is it ruby? We're just seeing that Daisy Duck is so powerful that it's creating these different types of in combination and aggressive styles. And people are still trying to figure that out. So maybe it's this one, maybe it's not. Time will tell as we lead, closer and closer to the Disney Lorcana challenges and really kind of get in a more established metagame. And definitely after two 2,000 player tournaments, we're going to have all the answers we need about the particular Shimmering Skies metagame. Amethyst Steel is another top 8 deck from the TPN 62 player tournament this past weekend. This is a deck that we haven't really covered much. There hasn't been a ton of successful decks for this, only in smaller tournaments that we haven't covered at this point. But this one is the first one, the top 8, a 60 plus player tournament. Felt like a good time to discuss what this deck's potential is. The standout card for me in this deck is Doc. Doc being a 2-cost, 1/3 uninkable, 1 lore character with the ability, when he hits the play, you get to discard your hand and draw 2 new cards. This is a very interesting concept of this deck, but when you really look at it and we go, we're not a whole new world deck, we don't have Maleficence, we don't have friends on the other side, we don't have any of these ways to draw cards. The library is the addition, and Amethyst Chromacon is the addition. But the cool thing about both of those cards is that they offer you choice in the timing of them. So if we draw Doc off the top as our first card for the turn, and we already have an Amethyst Chromacon in play, or we already have a library in play, we can first choose play the Doc, discard our hand, which has 0 cards, draw 2 cards, and then utilize Amethyst Chromacon, draw a 3rd card, or put a character in the library, challenge if we need to, then draw another card. So Doc always gives you that choice of how you want to draw your cards because of the way that Amethyst Chromacon and the library work alongside it. Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom is a card that I played this past week. There was actually an article I wrote on the Patreon. So if you're curious about the deck that I took to a top 4 finish this past weekend for our local, which was 27 players, by the way, and our room was stacked. We had participants that were day 2s of Disney Lorcana challenges, 4 members of the TFM team. It was a stacked tournament, and I played Gathering Knowledge and Wisdom in that deck, and it was very, very good, very, very powerful. I really loved it. This card might be a mainstay for Amethyst aggro decks. It might even be a card that people aren't even truly acknowledging how good it can be. That being said, we have Knowledge and Wisdom, we have our Merlins, we have the Madaman package, and of course we just have a plethora of lore with Maleficence, with our Pascals that gain a lot of pesky lore. Pinocchio is another addition. Of course, Smee and Lawrence. This deck is very much a turn our guys sideways, hope for the best. The one of Tiana is a very interesting tech card. I feel like it might be an addition and more of just like a, hey, we're going to try this out. Where I do think that I would probably just rather have my 4th snake over Tiana. While the card is very hard to deal with and, it can be a little bit problematic, I do worry about playing a 4-cost uninkable with 1 strength in a metagame where I assume the humanoid Sisu is going to be played more and more. That's definitely a big worry for me. But nonetheless, I think it's a good option to try. I do think it can lock certain players out of the game. But this deck also has 0 Pete Games Referee, which is a card that I absolutely would include in this. If you're looking for anything to add to this deck, I think the first thing I'm doing is adding Pete Games Referee. And I think this deck instantly gets better just by that particular decision. All in all, shout out to Drake here for a great top 8 at the TPN 62. Again, shout out to TPN Network. You guys are awesome. This was a deck that we missed covering last week, but because the results of it came in after we recorded the meta report. But this was a top 4 Amber Ruby deck played by Monty Cooper in a 54-player tournament. And I really like some of the Shimmering Skies addition to this deck. We see a Wreck-It Ralph. Wreck-It Ralph is the 7 cost, 6 strength, 7 willpower, 2 lore. It is uninkable Amber character with the ability of when he comes into play, you can return a character from your discard pile to your hand. And if it's a princess, you get to gain 2 lore. So if we look at this deck, we can see that Mulan's a princess, Rapunzel's are princesses. So we do have a couple princesses to get back to gain 2 lore, which is pretty great, pretty outstanding. But, really the 6/7 body that gets back any card that when you flip this with Mufasa is pretty good value. It's a gigantic stat stick. It's definitely going to be really close to similar to when you flip over a Carefree Stitch. In all honesty, when you flip over that 8 willpower, your opponents just go, oh, how do I do with 8 willpower? Same can be said about the 7 willpower here. They're both 2 lore characters. He's a little bit more sturdy with the strength, but if you can pick up Rapunzel off of this and just gain 2 lore and then have the threat that Rapunzel's going to draw more cards, that is a very, very threatening line for this particular game style. I also love the Mulan shift in this deck. It's a shift line that we don't get to see a ton of, but when you get to do it, when you really get to live that dream and showcase that power, I think it's one of the more unexpected lines in Lorcana. So I definitely see that being great. Revive is another addition here that it's really shocking to me this card hasn't caught on even more in the Mufasa playstyle. Mufasa being a 3/3 2 lore inkable character that replaces himself when banished is phenomenal when you can just revive it and put it right back into play. This idea where you're just like, yeah, I'm just going to always replace my cards as 2-for-1s for myself, with Mufasa being effectively a +1 every time you play it. Medusa, Lady Tremaine, Sisu, Maleficent, all these cards are very effective 2-for-1s. Even Wreck-It Ralph and Carefree Surfer on average might also be that kind of game style here, where you're just consistently threatening the board and making it really difficult for your opponent to ever have board control. I really do like this list. I think it's very interesting. The one thing that might be just a little bit too much is the Julieta. I'm not too crazy about that card. I don't even think this deck needs that card. I think I would rather just play Doc in the same position and just get my bigger threats on the table faster. Aside from that, huge shout out to Monty Cooper. This deck looks sweet. And anytime that I can see Wreck-It Ralph making an appearance, I'm going to be pretty excited about it because I'm a huge Wreck-It Ralph fan. And this card, I really do think is very, very close to being a threat to the metagame in Ruby or in Sapphire decks, maybe even Emerald decks. But here we are looking at it now, and I do really like what it's offering in this list. So really fun to see. And again, congratulations on the top 4 finish. Okay, so now we can see that this is the breakdown of the top cut decks. So while, right, like if you guys remember that chart from like a few minutes ago, Amber Steel had like 140 registered decks. Only like 10 of them are seeing top cuts. That's interesting, right? That's an interesting fact, is that in most cases what you see is that when the top deck is the most registered deck, you also see that being kind of like a skyscraper to the top cut decks. That's not what we're seeing here at all. So you're seeing Ruby Amethyst and Ruby Sapphire be successful, even though it's being far less played in top cuts. Now, granted, obviously that number is not focused on all tournaments, and the overall number is through 3 gigantic events of registered decks. So we're not seeing that in every tournament. I'm not sitting here saying that every registered tournament is a 3-to-1 for Amber Steel to Ruby Sapphire, or 3-to-1 to Ruby Amethyst. So that's kind of why it does look like this. But it's really just an understanding of, like, although in those first couple events we had very, very large turnouts for Amber Steel, the success isn't necessarily matching that number just yet. Do I think it's possible? Absolutely. I think that deck got 3 of the best cards in Shimmering Skies, and when you have things like that, it's very likely for that to be the most dominant deck. So while I think this is interesting, while you can kind of showcase and see, okay, the top end here is pretty close with 10, 9, 9, Amber Steel, Amethyst Ruby, and Ruby Sapphire. And then you can see the trickle off to Amethyst Emerald kind of picking up some steam. being a little bit more successful this past weekend than it was its first weekend. Amethyst Steel, Sapphire Steel, Amber Emerald, Amber Ruby, and Emerald Steel all picking up top cuts. It's really just about understanding that this metagame, in even a top cut form, is showcasing 9 successful decks in the early weeks. And this is just tournaments that are over 50 players. So obviously in smaller tournaments, we've seen other in combinations be successful as well, but this one was a little bit more targeted to the larger tournaments and the breakdowns of those and the top cuts of those. Really great to see this type of diversity early on, and really nothing that skyscraper at all. You can kind of target and say, all right, the top 3 decks right now are Amber Steel, Ruby Amethyst, Ruby Sapphire. And there's a lot of notables to really even clarify that in the larger tournaments. These are the decks that were in the top 4 or making up the top 8s in these bigger tournaments. They might not just be seeing as much play in smaller tournaments, because even like me, I played a million games with Amber Steel. I understand that what Pete Referee and what Prince Naveen can do for the deck and how it can make it better and what Daisy can do for the deck. But right now I'm kind of in an exploring phase of I want to try other ink combinations. I want to understand what Shimmering Skies can do for other decks to see if they give them that potential to be playable. And I feel like there's a good chance that in smaller tournaments, 30, 40 player tournaments, your local 1Ks or your box tournaments, you might see competitive players actually just kind of testing themselves and testing the waters and maybe not playing what is perceived as the best decks. So therefore, you might see things like that. Whereas in the larger tournaments, we have seen Ruby Amethyst be successful, Ruby Sapphire be successful, and of course, Amber Steel be successful. So I think it's a weird situation now where the DLC is, a lot of the top heavy thing that we're working towards, getting that Continental's invite and things like that, or the CCS 10K. I mean, top prize is $3,000. So obviously you want to bring your best for that and things in those conversations. But smaller EV tournaments, very likely that players are kind of testing the waters and testing decks and not putting too much stake on saying, oh, I need to win a box today. It's really more important that I just get information about a deck so I can win a Continental's invite. Way more important. I mean, specifically to me, guys. I'm just being honest. But there are 2 more decks we want to focus on, and they're decks that we actually haven't seen much of at all. So let's get into them. Emerald Steel, Clarabelle, played by Mars18, was second place in a 61-player tournament. And we are a Clarabelle deck here. We have Diablos in our deck, which I think is interesting because there hasn't been many Emerald decks that I have seen focused on trying to get Clarabelle and Diablo in their list, but this is one of them. It's also notable that this deck is also playing Beast Tragic Hero. So yeah, this deck is probably $1 bazillion. If my guess is it's probably in the $700 range, maybe a little bit more if I'm being completely honest, because we do have Diablo, Beast Tragic Hero, Robin Hood, and Clarabelle, all gigantic legendary cost. And even Tinkerbell is one of the more expensive secret rares. Grab Your Swords and things like that aren't necessarily cheap either. Pete Referee is one of the more expensive uncommons. So yeah, I can fathom this deck being close to $600-700. But none of that really matters if the deck is playable or not. The cost is kind of just the cost. I do think that this deck is offering a ton of threats. What I love about decks like this, and I'm really specific about this, is that I love when you put cards in play and your opponent has to answer them. I mean, look at this deck. Diablo, Tragic Hero, Robin Hood, Tinkerbell, Clarabelle. I mean, all of those cards are game-winning potential cards. Literally just Diablo, Tragic Hero, and Clarabelle alone. All 3 of them are draw engines that your opponent has to answer, or you just get to outvalue them. Drawing a card a turn from Diablo or more, drawing 1 extra card from Beast, great. Drawing up to 3, 4, 5 cards with Clarabelle, insane. The idea that you can just do this with so many different cards, threaten the early game, have your opponent remove threats like Diablo, like Beast, just to follow up with a Clarabelle and say, it's cool, I'm just going to draw 4 cards because that's how many you have in your hand. It's kind of insane. It really is. So I really like the idea that this is the style that Emerald Steel is going towards. And I'm very curious if this is the type of deck that we're going to see be successful in a Shimmering Skies metagame, because I do think that there is a lot of potential here. And yes, it is expensive, so maybe that kind of like buckles it down a little bit. Not everyone can just pick up a $750 deck and play it. But this concept of every card I play is a threat, or every card I play is removing a threat, like our Ursula Deceivers, and of course our song package, that's all really great and dandy. Having the Hidden Cove also being annoying. I think this deck is probably going under the radar right now. It's not a very highly registered deck for Emerald Steel, and it's also not one of the more successful top cut decks, but this is one of the few that have made top cuts. And I really felt like I want to put a spotlight on it because I do think there's a lot of potential here in this deck, kind of finding and molding its way into the metagame and really being a deck that's forcing people to answer it rather than this deck trying to answer them. We'll have to see if time, kind of shows that. But I do think that this is one of the deck that might be a little hidden. So shout out to Mars 18 on an awesome finish in your 61 player tournament. Last but not least is the Lamb Chop Top 8 CCS 10K, playing Sapphire Steel. And the one card that we have to point out here is none other than Kronk. Kronk is a 6-cost inkable character, 4 strength, 5 willpower, 2 lore with resist 1, and the ability Scout Leader. During your turn, whenever this character banishes another character in a challenge, you may do 2 damage to chosen character. Effectively, what Kronk is in this particular deck list is the 5th Tinkerbell. No, we can't shift. We can't immediately sing songs or do crazy things like Tinkerbell can. But in a world where understanding that 4 willpower is king means that 4 strength is also king. So having a 5th Tinkerbell with almost the exact same ability in the end, of course, we're missing the spread 1 damage, but we also pick up a resist 1. So we're even a tad bit more sturdy and we can survive cards like And Then Along Came Zeus and really be kind of annoying to the metagame. I think it's a very interesting choice. I think it's probably a good one. Having the ability to remove so many 4 willpower cards just by yourself is awesome. And then the addition to do 2 more damage to something else can really just like kind of slow down board position for aggro decks. This is also a deck that's playing Mickey Mouse. We're playing Fishbone Quill. We don't have a hard time getting this card out even earlier, which is another great thing. In the end, it's inkable. We got to get rid of it. Awesome. Send it away. Who cares? It dodges Medusa. It dodges Sisu. It dodges Brawl. Like, Tinkerbell is one of the most annoying characters for Ruby Amethyst to deal with if they're not playing cards like Lady Tremaine or Be King Undisputed, because, your board is kind of in some cases smaller, but this deck also has the potential to be like a 2 or 3 character lineup in play at any given time against Ruby decks. So really what you're telling me is that like this is a card that's going to come in play and just be a 4/5 with 2 lore that has the ability to challenge incredibly well and just be really annoying to opponents' strategies. I think it's a very interesting choice. I do think that Tinkerbell is a phenomenal card in this metagame. And if Tinkerbell is a phenomenal card in the metagame, then a card like Kronk is very easily a playable card, I believe. Time will tell if this actually becomes more copies of it, but I had to really shout that out. I thought it was a really cool addition. It was the first thing I noticed when I had seen this deck list. The rest of this, I do think, is a very straightforward Sapphire Steel deck. The only additions from Shimmering Sky looks to be Pete Games Referee, which is just another card that says, hey, later on in the game, I'm going to play a card like Bell, and then I'm going to follow up Bell with my Pete and say, if you have to have a hyper specific answer to my Bell, or I'm just going to gain 10 or 15 lore next turn and just win. So I really like that Keep protects our win strategies. It really does remove a lot of the problems that can kind of interact with you through action. So this concept of Pete being this ultimate like chump card to protect yourself from some of your more annoying matchups to recover from, I think will go a long way. I also think just being like able to stop Amber Emerald from singing for a couple turns or stop Amber Steel for singing for a turn might give you the opportunity to like really flip the script on a particular game and kind of put them in a worse position. Or really what it does is it might give you the idea to just be like, I can get one more resource out of my Fishbone Quill before they wheel, things like that. Very, very subtle things, But all in all, I think it does protect the entire deck and concept very, very well. Guys, quick reminder that we have a merch shop. It's been really great and fun seeing so many of you guys at DLCs coming up, saying hello. If you're looking to really go to the next level and support us in that manner, you should check out the merch store, guys. The link will be in the pinned comments below, also in the description. Buy a shirt, buy a hoodie, really support the Forbidden Mountain brand in a nice way and showcase it at your locals and things like that. Love just kind of starting the conversation through the Forbidden Mountain. Anyone that does purchase, thank you in advance. And of course, we got one more thing to talk about. That's it. We broke them down. We had a lot of decks to talk about, a lot of new decks, which is really cool and fun and interesting. But guys, it's time to get to the nitty gritty. And here it is. We have 2 Disney Lorcana challenges coming up in just a few short weeks, Las Vegas and Birmingham. They're going to be simulcasted, even though Birmingham is 9 hours. We might actually get almost the entire Birmingham tournament complete on day one. Probably not, if we're being honest. Probably like 6 or 7 rounds of it before Vegas even starts because of the time gap, because Vegas is on the West Coast, and then, of course, Birmingham's over in the UK. So 9-hour time difference is massive, but it might honestly affect some of the decisions being made in deck lists being registered for Vegas, which is interesting to say that we can kind of have that happen on the same day. If you see a deck that's gone 6-0 in day one or 5-0, an undefeated deck and things like that, you might see a card that you're not used to. It's very possible that things like that happen. Nonetheless, very excited to work towards that, get to DLCs, going to be playing in some events. Listen, another thing, in case you guys haven't missed it yet, the Twitch chat is back. I don't know why I said Twitch chat, but Twitch channel is going to be a little bit more active than the coming days. We have a new schedule kind of we're working on that we're going to be publishing very soon. So if you haven't yet and you want to catch me live on Twitch on mornings between 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. or 10 a.m. and 1 p.m., then you should definitely go and follow the Twitch, which is twitch.tv/The Forbidden Mountain. Also, link will be in the description, of course. But nonetheless, looking forward to really breaking down tournaments more in depth, kind of like a one-by-one. I'm also going to be going over some of the most recent gameplay that I can find. So if I can find any gameplay from events, maybe you're going to see me there kind of talk through what I think is going on, maybe even kind of like cast it in a way or recast it in a way. Definitely going to be doing some different breakdowns. But all in all, DLC Vegas, I'll be there. Almost the entire team of TFM is going to be in Vegas, which is pretty awesome. It'll be a lot of fun. Vegas is an awesome city, and it should be a great time for everyone. If you haven't yet, hit the like button for me, of course. And as always, if you're new here, we do these weekly breakdowns every single week, kind of catching you up on what the most successful decks were in the metagame. Thank you guys so much for watching today. Hit subscribe if you haven't. We'll catch you in the next video.